This is Romans 9, starting verse 30. I know I'm dropping in the middle of a dissertation or something, a thesis that Paul's writing. He's doing great, and I'm dropping in the middle of his thought here. But really, there's backstory to where I'm starting, but you're going to see the point. He asks this question, what shall we say then? So that means there's previous things that would behoove you to look back on, but he making a point here that it says in verse 30, that the Gentiles which followed not after righteousness, that means they did not have the law given to them, right? Israel did. They didn't. They followed after anything that, the Greeks, the Romans, any Egyptians. They're all called Gentiles. They did not have the word of God given to them. So he's saying they didn't follow after righteousness from their ancient fathers and all their writings and all this stuff. Their stories don't involve God. However, it says they have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. How did those Gentile people get righteousness, God's nature? Just go ahead. Righteousness equals God's nature. How did they get God's nature when they did not have a long-term history in their people, their upbringing, that they weren't really influenced by God? How did they get righteousness, the nature of God, at that level? He's arguing that they do have it. So he goes into answering the question. Wherefore? How'd they get it? Verse 31. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness. Two righteousness right here. There's two versions. Verse 30, it talks about the righteousness which is of faith. And then verse 31, righteousness which is of the law. You can have two kinds of righteousness running in your life. You can have law-driven righteousness, or you could have faith-driven righteousness. One is superior. One looks good. The other one is what God's looking for. Verse 31, but Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. They had it. Wherefore, in verse 32, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. So what did God do? He sent a stumbling block. Who's this? It says, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone, stumbling block, stumbling stone. This is a reference to the prophecy in Isaiah that Jesus was going to be that rock of offense. He's going to disrupt their system of righteousness by showing what relationship or faith-based righteousness look like. Not like, what's your faith? Are you a Muslim? No. But faith as in relating to God at the spirit level. So how, pulling this down, two righteousness. This is one of my things I want you to take away with. Righteousness that's of the law or righteousness that is of faith? One, they both look very similar, don't they? Come on, I've seen very unsaved people that do not adhere to anything that God teaches be quite loving, kind, do-gooding. How can they get away with do-gooding and not have God in their life? Is that, this is why you have the whole fairy tale of St. Peter at the gate going to measure out your good and bad deeds. This is why the world can have some righteousness, because they feel like they got some goody in them. And the deception is now even here for Christians that have a relationship with God and fall back into a system of righteousness after the law. It is possible that once you've been reformed on the inside, you get comfortable and go back into law-based righteousness. So God knew that law-based righteousness was going to create problems. It was not satisfying the ultimate spiritual issue. So he sent a stumbling stone. Yay, the mighty fortress is our God. He came and disrupted law-based righteousness, law-based God nature. And in verse 33, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and rock of offense. And whosoever believes on him shall not be ashamed. Here's where it takes the same things of who God the Word is and now puts it in person form. That's all that God was doing between the Old and New Testament. He was putting it in relationship form so that you can't control anything at that point. You cannot make a system out of God, and God wanted them to see they needed more than just the law itself. So, verse 1 in chapter 10, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. Law-based righteousness is still very heavy in that nation. It never departed. And they still practice and do things today that satisfy a lot of Old Testament stuff, rules and regulations, and they're wanting to fulfill it even more with the advent of the third temple. But really, isn't that third temple just going to be built for the Antichrist anyway? I mean, I want them to understand and the fullness that they could have righteousness by faith. But I'm not going to just believe that for them. We have to believe it as believers that the conversion happens not through what we know, but through humility and submission. That's really the difference between the two righteousness. Righteousness is righteous I don't know. How do you pluralize righteousness? Anyway, you get my point. Two forms, law versus faith. Verse 2, For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. Keyword submitted. Submission, come into agreement with. This is where righteousness, God, having God's nature, folks, has to happen not at your intellect. It has to happen at your spirit.